All right, let's dive into something that's been creating a lot of buzz in India, something called One Nation, One Election. And believe me, it's a lot more complicated than it sounds.
It really is. I mean, the basic idea is to, well, synchronize India's election cycles.
Yeah.
You know, instead of having separate elections for the Lok Sabha and all the different state assemblies, they'd all happen at the same time.
On the same day?
Yeah, on the same day.
Wow. So are you telling me that India has never actually done this before?
Well, not never. Believe it or not, India actually held simultaneous elections for, like, almost 20 years right after independence.
Really?
From 1951 to 1967.
Huh. So why did they stop?
It's kind of a long story. We'll get into that in a bit. But for now, let's just say things changed, and it became a lot more difficult to keep all those election cycles in sync.
Interesting. So is that why we have all this research piled up here?
Yeah.
Because this whole idea of simultaneous elections is back on the table.
Exactly. And one of the most important documents we have is this report from a high-level committee that was put together to explore this whole idea. They were led by former President Ram Nath Kovind, so it was a pretty big deal.
Okay. And what did they find?
Well, they did a lot of research, like a lot. They got input from over 21,500 people from all over the country.
Wow. So what did those people think? Were they on board with this one nation, one election thing?
You know, it's pretty remarkable, actually. 80% of the people they surveyed were in favor of it.
80%. That's a pretty clear majority. But what about the other 20%? I mean, there must have been some concerns, right?
Oh, absolutely. While the report doesn't get into the specifics of every concern, I think it's safe to say that the sheer scale of implementing simultaneous elections in a country as big and diverse as India is, well, it's a bit daunting, to say the least.
It's a pretty massive undertaking. So you mentioned that India used to hold these simultaneous elections, right?
Yeah.
What happened? Why did they stop?
Well, imagine you're trying to keep a bunch of clocks perfectly in sync, but someone keeps changing the time on one of them. That's kind of what happened with India's elections. You see, between 1951 and 1967, it worked because both the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies had fixed terms of 5 years.
5 years. Okay.
But then some state assemblies had to dissolve early, and that just threw off the whole synchronized system.
And even the Lok Sabhas had some early dissolutions over the years, right?
Exactly. So it's not quite as simple as just flipping a switch and going back to the way things were.
Got it. So what about this committee? What did they recommend? Did they just say, hey, let's go back to simultaneous elections? Or was there more to it?
Well, they actually proposed a two-phased approach. You know, something a bit more measured.
2 phases.
Yeah. So in phase 1, they'd focus on getting the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies all on the same page, election-wise. Then, within 100 days, phase 2 would kick in.
Or what happens in phase 2?
Well, that's when they'd bring in the municipalities and panchayats.
Ah, so local government elections would be included too.
Precisely.
Wow, so within 100 days, India could potentially hold elections for all levels of government? That's ambitious. But wouldn't that just create absolute chaos? I mean, having everyone vote for everything all at once?
You're not wrong to think that. It would definitely be a challenge. But the committee actually had a pretty interesting idea to streamline things. They suggested having a single electoral roll and voter ID card for all 3 tiers of government, you know, so you wouldn't need a separate card for each election.
Oh, that makes sense. It would definitely simplify things.
Yeah.
So I'm still curious, why are people even considering this massive change to India's electoral system? I mean, is it just about saving money and manpower?
Well, that's certainly a factor, but the committee's report actually highlighted something a bit more fundamental: governance. They argue that the constant cycle of elections can really distract the government from, you know, actually governing.
I can see that. If you're always in campaign mode, how can you focus on the real issues? It's like trying to write a novel while juggling flaming torches. You might be able to keep those torches in the air, but that novel's not going to get written.
That's a great analogy.
So less campaigning, more governing. Sounds like a good idea to me.
And what about this model code of conduct everyone keeps talking about? How would that play into all of this?
Ah, yes, the model code of conduct. It's basically a set of rules that kicks in as soon as an election is announced, you know, meant to prevent the party in power from using its position for, well, unfair advantage.
Sounds fair enough.
And while the intention's good, it can kind of freeze government activity. You know, no new projects can be started, no big decisions can be made. It's meant to keep things fair, but it can also make it hard to get things done.
So with simultaneous elections, the impact of the model code of conduct would be?
Minimized, which could lead to a more consistent, focused approach to governing. Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal. But hold on a second. Wouldn't this whole thing just favor the big national parties? What about the regional parties? Wouldn't they get lost in the shuffle?
That's a common concern, but some experts actually argue the opposite. They say that with all the attention focused on one massive election, regional parties might actually have a better chance to connect with voters on a more local level.
Really? How so?
Well, their issues and concerns wouldn't be drowned out by all the noise of a national campaign. And, they could even gain more leverage in forming coalitions.
That's an interesting angle I hadn't considered. So we've got potential benefits for governance, efficiency, and maybe even for regional parties. But I'm guessing there are some concerns too, right? I mean, this all sounds a bit too good to be true.
Of course, there are concerns. Some of them quite significant, actually, but we'll get into those after a clip.
Oh, come on, don't leave us hanging.
We need to take a break, and then we'll be back to discuss the potential downsides of one nation, one election.
Stay tuned, everyone, to hear what those downsides might be.
It'll be worth the wait. Okay, so where were we? Ah, yes, the potential downsides of one nation, one election. And there are a few. Like I said, some are pretty major concerns that we need to consider.
Okay, lay it on me. What are the biggest worries people have?
Well, one of the biggest is just how incredibly complex this would be to pull off. We're talking about a huge country, a complex system, and decades of, well, you could say tradition.
I mean, India's electoral system has been built up over, 75 years, right? Since independence?
Yeah, pretty much. So trying to change it and synchronize everything from the Lok Sabha to the local panchayats, it's a bit like trying to rewire a supercomputer while it's running.
One wrong move and the whole thing crashes. Is that what people are worried about?
It's definitely a concern. Then there's the whole issue of voter fatigue. Think about it. You walk into the voting booth and you've got a ballot the size of a very long list.
For all levels of government.
Exactly. Could be overwhelming, right? Especially if you're not following every race super closely.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, you might end up just choosing randomly or just not voting at all. And wouldn't that be the opposite of what we're trying to achieve?
Exactly. It could actually undermine the democratic process. And then there's a deeper concern about the impact on federalism. India, as we know, it's a union of states. Each one has its own flavor, its own priorities.
A lot of people see India's federal structure as one of its strengths, right? That diversity.
Right. And some folks worry that simultaneous elections could shift power too much towards the central government.
Meaning regional issues wouldn't get enough attention.
That's the concern. And what happens if a government, let's say at the national level, collapses before its term's up? Right now, we have separate state elections, so a change in leadership there doesn't necessarily rock the boat for the whole country.
It's kind of a safety valve.
But if we're all synced up, a midterm collapse could trigger a domino effect, leading to fresh elections everywhere. Chaos.
Not exactly the stability we're looking for.
Right. And let's not forget the financial side of things. While simultaneous elections could save money in the long run, just think about how much it would cost to actually make it happen.
Yeah.
Overhauling the whole system. Massive.
We're talking big bucks.
Huge. And some people are saying, look, India's got other priorities right now. Spend the money on those. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It's a trade-off. I mean, It's like you wouldn't remodel your kitchen if your roof was leaking.
Yeah.
Right. Fix the essentials first.
Perfect example. So yeah, it's not simple. Lots of potential benefits, but also these big, anxieties, I guess you could call them.
The committee acknowledged these anxieties, right? Did they offer any solutions or at least ways to, minimize the risks?
They did try to address some of them, like the logistics, for example, staggering the voting hours maybe to avoid overcrowding, using more technology maybe for things like registration and verification, adding more polling stations, stuff like that.
Trying to think it through. Practical solutions.
Right. And they also suggested maybe amending the Constitution, to have fixed terms for both the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies.
So less chance of those early dissolutions that mess up the schedule. But even with those fixes, it still feels like a big gamble, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But some people think it's a gamble worth taking. They say the potential benefits, for governance, for national unity, they outweigh the risks.
It's a bet on the future of Indian democracy. A hope that this will make things, better in the long run.
Exactly. But it brings up the big question, is this the right path?
Right.
Is one nation, one election the way to go, or a dangerous experiment that might backfire?
That's a tough one. I don't know if we have enough information to answer that definitively. But we've looked at both sides, haven't we? The good and the bad. I guess it's up to each person to decide where they stand.
It's a choice, for sure, a complex one.
I mean, we've gone over the arguments, the evidence, the risks. But it's not just about the practical stuff, is it? This idea, it touches on something deeper about what Indian democracy is, or what it should be.
It's a very philosophical question, isn't it? What's the best way for the people to have their voices heard? What role should elections play? Big questions.
Yeah, as we're talking about all of this, I can't help but think about the bigger picture. It's not just about, logistics and dates on a calendar. It's about how we view democracy itself.
It's about the philosophy behind it all. What does it even mean to have a government that truly reflects what people want? And do elections, the way we do them now, are they really the best way to make that happen?
It makes you wonder if we're maybe tinkering with the very foundation of Indian democracy. Like, are we allowed to change the code? And if we do, what might happen? Good and bad.
Some of the people who support this one nation, one election idea, they actually say it could make democracy stronger.
Really? How so?
Well, they argue that fewer elections, bigger elections, it would be harder for, money and powerful people to influence things.
It would be harder to rig the system, you mean? Less chance of corruption?
Exactly. Fewer opportunities for that kind of stuff to happen. But some people are worried it could actually make things worse.
Worse? How?
They're concerned that if all the power is concentrated in a few big elections, well, the parties with the most money, the most connections, they might end up dominating everything.
So the smaller parties, the independent candidates, they'd get squeezed out.
That's the worry. It could stifle debate, limit the choices people have.
It's almost like it could go either way. Democracy could become more fair or less fair, depending on how it's all done. It's a risk.
It is. And there's another question that comes up about people getting involved,
Yeah.
participating. If we have fewer elections, will people just become less interested in politics altogether?
Or maybe it would free up their time to get involved in other ways. Maybe they'd be more active in their communities or, start their own initiatives.
That's an interesting thought. We don't really know, do we? It's all speculation at this point. More research is definitely needed on that. But the bottom line is, this is a big deal. It's not just a minor tweak to the system. It's about potentially changing the way Indian democracy works at a fundamental level.
And it's a discussion that's happening right now all over the country. The committee's report has really got people talking, and there's no easy answer. It's going to be debated for a long time.
It's a healthy debate to have, I think. It shows that democracy is alive and well in India. People care about these issues, and they're willing to engage in these difficult conversations.
That's what makes it so fascinating. It's not just about the facts and figures. It's about values, about principles, about the kind of society we want to build.
Exactly. And as we wrap up this deep dive into one nation, one election, I want to leave our listeners with this. Democracy isn't static. It's always changing. It has to adapt to new challenges, new realities. This idea we've been discussing, it's just one example of how India is grappling with those changes, trying to find a way forward.
A way to create a system that's both efficient and fair, both stable and responsive to what people want. It's a journey, not a destination. And I'm glad we could all be on this journey together, exploring these ideas and, maybe even challenging our own assumptions along the way.
That's what it's all about. So thanks to everyone for listening.
And for thinking deeply about these crucial issues. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.